All right. Hello, class. My name is Stephen Sullivan, and I'll be your facilitator for the Wife of Bath Prologue presentation. So, on the left there, that's a picture of him, of Geoffrey Chaucer. Probably when he was about, I don't know, later on in his life, when he was probably, after writing most of the Canterbury Tales, probably in his Parliament days. I'm just speculating though. But let's get into it. Let's start with the early life of Geoffrey Chaucer. He was born in London, circa 1340. His parents were John and Agnes de Compton Chaucer. They were wealthy wine merchants and deputy to the king's butler. So they were pretty high in the social hierarchy when it came to London during those times. So his family lived a pretty comfortable and cushy lifestyle. And through the family connections, he pursued a position in the royal courts and became a squire in the court of Elizabeth, the Countess of Ulster, the wife of Lionel, Earl of Ulster, later the Duke of Clarence. He was essentially a butler. But in the time he spent working in the courts, he made a lot of political connections, such as John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. And this helped him out later on in his life, which we'll talk about later on. But let's move on. And he was still in his teens during all this, so he was still pretty young. But later on, in 1359, Chaucer joined the English invasion of France in the 100 Years' War and was taken prisoner. There was a ransom for his release, and that was paid for by King Edward III a year later in his imprisonment in 1360. This was greatly due and thanks to those connections he made. So when he returned to England, Chaucer spent his time in the royal service as a diplomat, traveling abroad. And during that time, he became acquainted with authors such as Dante and Petrarch, who greatly influenced his work. And we'll talk about that more later on too. So down the road, many years later now, he became controller of customs for the Port of London. And that was a pretty important position for him, and probably influenced a lot of the Canterbury Tales and a lot of the characters in that. Later on, 1386, Geoffrey Chaucer became elected a member of Parliament shortly before his death, 4 years later. All right. So let's talk about the Canterbury Tales. So a little backstory. The Canterbury Tales are a collection of 24 stories about a pilgrimage from London to Canterbury, involving many different members of society. And the goal was to visit the shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral. And the group consists of mostly middle-class members of society. And during the embarkment of this trek, they decide to have a storytelling contest. The prize for the best story is a free meal at the destination. And like I said, it's 24 stories in the whole Canterbury Tales, but it's actually left unfinished, and it's still not completed because, one, I think it's in a way kind of meant to be like that, but we'll talk about more about that later. Moving on. Here's a little fun anime drawing I found of just some of the characters. On the far left, we have the wife of Bath, the shipman, parson, the miller, the sumner, and so on. I like it. I like it though. It gives like a little fun portrayal of all of them. Yeah, they're fun. Anyways, so in terms of structure, the wife of Bath tale is after the man of law's tale and before the friar's tale. And a lot of that, when interpreting, I think considering what it is in response to and what each tale is kind of trying to rectify, I think that's really important to consider. But Allison, that's the wife of Bath, that's her name. She starts the tale by stating, "I have 5 husbands at the church door," and she's ready for another husband. Just some of the characteristics of the wife of Bath. She's described as loud, brassy, and unembarrassed. The antithesis of womanly virtue of the time, of the medieval times, that Chaucer wrote Canterbury Tales. There's 2 schools of thought when it comes to Alison's character, and it's kind of split, but which Chaucer never weighed in personally. But Alison is either a strong portrayal of women during the medieval times, where gender equality in society was rampant. The other school of thought is Alison's character was meant as satirical. So, when listening to this presentation or when reading the Canterbury Tales and coming into the wife of Bath's tale and prologue, that's something to think about. All right, moving on. So just a little more about the structure. The story is an age-old plot structure, a cycle narrative, where we have a main plot, and then in parallel fashion, subplots shooting off from that main plot. This is now a widely used kind of device in narrative storytelling, but we can see it in television series such as The X-Files. All right, so let's just get into the summary of the prologue. The wife of Bath, Allison, begins by claiming she is the authority on marriage, for she has been married 5 times. Instead of following Jesus' example, she finds her own ways to interpret scriptures, the Bible. Christianity was the main religion in England during that time of medieval. Allison uses King Solomon as an example, who has many wives and married often. So we can kind of see a double standard kind of being in Allison's rhetorical arguments. If men can do it, why can't women? She then begins to challenge God's stance on virginity, and she uses sexuality as a way of manipulation and control in marriage. At this point in the story, or in the prologue, the partner interrupts. He's about to get married, and Allison comically tells him to shut up, and after the tale, he will be able to make a choice from listening to her point of view. At this point in the narrative, it takes a form of almost a confession and defends her sins. Quote. So, Allison had a total of 5 husbands so far. But remember, she's ready for a new husband. But in a little bit of the history of her marriages, she states that 3 were good and 2 were bad. The 3 good ones were good to her because they were obedient to her, meaning they gave her their money and their land to her. She would even go as far and blame husbands for cheating on her with neighbors, which they did not, and she knew. But she wanted that control over them. She goes on a rant of what men and women want. To Allison, men want women for their beauty or money or land. An ugly woman will see any man who looks at her and will jump on him with animal lust, is kind of the thought that Allison has. And she goes on to another rant about trust and marriage. Allison says husbands should just trust their wives and let them do what they want to do. The astronomer, I'm going to butcher his name, Ptolemy, I believe his name is pronounced, he agrees with her and says that she knows best. Sorry, got a little crazy with the transitions. So Allison begins to tell the group. Remember, this is a pilgrimage, and they're all telling each other stories. But she tells the group of her fourth husband who cheated on her. So she made his life hell. The fifth husband, Jenkin, I think his name is pronounced, she married him for his looks. When he first met him, she was still married to her fourth husband, the one that cheated on her. And it was after his funeral, Jenkin, the new husband, was one of the cast bearers. And then after the funeral, that's when they married a month later. Jenkin and Allison quarrel about a book on the history of unfaithful wives. And she tears a page out of the book and slaps him. Jenkins smacks her back, and she feigns death, so he would feel guilty, and she would regain control and restore that power balance that she needs. The friar complains now at this point about the length of her tale, and it's I think one of the longer stories in the canon of Canterbury Tales. And then a quarrel then begins with the summoner, between the friar and the summoner, and then the host tells the wife to, you can start her story again after the quarreling, which happens a lot during the Canterbury Tales. So then at this point, the wife re-begins her story, and that's when the prologue ends and the tale begins. So far in the prologue, there's a few things that we can kind of get a picture of that Chaucer is either telling through just his narrative. We can get a picture of some of the medieval kind of social structures. So the first question I have is, what are some of the common medieval stereotypes of women that the wife of Bath presents to the reader in her prologue? And what does the wife of Bath suggest of the power dynamics between men and women? Think of her account of her husbands and what happened between them and how she considered them good or bad. And do you think Chaucer, do you think the person Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, is pro-female and highlights the gender equality during the medieval era? Or is he more satirical in his portrayal of women, making them into a farce? So earlier I told you about the two schools, and which school do you think you would land in? And yeah, anyways, that's it. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and looking forward to the tale. So yeah, thank you. Have a good one.